Hey, I'm Brian Briscoe, host of the Diary of an Apartment Investor podcast. And this podcast is different from everything else out there. I bring together new and aspiring investors on each and every episode and let the aspiring investors ask the questions that they need answered. And if you're an aspiring investor yourself, you probably have the same questions. So before you get to this episode that we have prepared for you, make sure you hit the subscribe button and that little notification bell to make sure you get notified every time we post a new episode. And now, enjoy the show.
Well, that said, Cristina, we got Mike on the line. What do you want to ask him?
How do you split your responsibilities with your partner?
We both tried on the first deal to understand what each other was doing, right? And we both wanted to understand the basics, the building blocks to the entire process so that we could get through those. But we had a long working relationship. And in fact, we're coming up on 8 years working together in the office. And so, a lot of people are very strict about how they do it. I think you have to figure out the relationship you have with your partner. Bernie and I tend to, he sees that I'm doing something and he'll pick up something on his side that I normally handle, but he'll ask me what he needs. And so there's a flexibility in there, but in general, we do have some relatively, they're not defined roles, but in general, each one of us has areas that we gravitate towards.
All right. Welcome to another episode of the Diary of an Apartment Investor podcast. I'm your host, Brian Briscoe, with another great show. We have another Ask the Expert episode with two great people on the line. We've got Mike Shaughnessy and Cristina Colon. So as tradition, Mike, you're the expert investor today. So you're up to bat first. Welcome, Mike.
Welcome. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
And Cristina, welcome to you too, but we'll save your story for a little later. I'm happy to have you on too.
I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. All right. So Mike, do us a favor. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us a story of, where you were and how you got into real estate.
Sure. So my background was military after undergrad. And I spent about 13 years on active duty, traveling around the world in the country. And when I got off active duty, I flew for both the Navy and the Air Force, which is a different story. But
yeah. That's not usual is what I have to say. And I remember asking you about it when I saw your bio. I'm just like, how? But usually people stick with one service.
They do. And I think that goes to my entrepreneurial bent, So I saw an opportunity and I went after it. And that's how I ended up in the Air Force. And it was a great way to finish out a spectacular military career. But when I got off active duty, I was flying professionally, I started a private aviation company. And so there was that interest in entrepreneurial ventures. And I decided to go back to business school. And I went to one of the big Ivy League business schools, and that was going to be a great experience. And I ended up getting a job with a Wall Street firm. And I thought I had the brass ring. I thought that everything was going to be easy after that. The hard work was going to stop. And I was working for one of the big bulge bracket firms, and it was all great. Then the financial crisis happened. And so I realized that I had different priorities, and I wanted to spend more time with my family. I wanted to be closer to home. I wanted to work on my own things. Yep. And so I started to look for more entrepreneurial ventures, and I ran a couple of small companies. And then I came to this one small company that I was asked to come help build that I still work at. It's my W-2 job. And I ran into this crazy guy who's my partner. And we started a couple things talking about how we could do some things on the side here and there. In fact, our first venture was we built a couple of mining rigs for Bitcoin. Again, another story. But, we were both searching for something that would satisfy both our intellectual curiosity and our the ability for us to lever up our efforts. Yep. We were working for a very stable company. It was a lot of fun, but there wasn't a huge event at the end. And the other thing that both of us realized was that we were no longer on our own time. Yeah. We were working for someone else. We had to be there every day. We had to be there, 8 to 10 hours a day. And at the end of the day, we weren't building for ourselves or our family. We were building for someone else, albeit getting a nice, getting paid handsomely and all that, but we weren't building our own thing. And so after a while, we realized that Bernie came to me and said, my partner's name is Bernie. He came to me and said, hey, I'm looking into this multifamily thing. And I kind of scratched my head because I didn't understand it.
Yeah.
And I didn't understand how we could do what we needed to do and get a bunch of capital and go out and buy an asset that had a lot of investment required.
Yeah.
So he educated me, gave me a bunch of books. I read through the books. I heard some great podcasts, got some great information from podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked again, and we both sold our houses and decided to go into multifamily.
Yeah.
And that was kind of it. And the big why for us and the motivation was, we both want to spend more time with our families. We want to work hard. We want to stay intellectually engaged. But at the same time, we want to choose when we work. We don't want to work at 8, 9 to 5 every day. Maybe we work 3 hours on Saturday. Maybe we work 10 hours on Sunday, and we take Monday off. And so that was the big why, to spend more time with our family, to generate long-term wealth for our family, and to really have our own time.
Yeah. And that's something that, I appreciate now as well. We have somewhat of a shared history. I went straight to multifamily from the military, didn't have I had a straight path to get here. But, this morning, for example, my kids had a doctor's appointment, and something I haven't done in 20 years, I took my kids to the doctor. I didn't have to ask anybody permission, and it was a great thing, so took my kids to the doctor, dropped them off at school with McDonald's Happy Meals in hand right at lunchtime. So
that's awesome.
Yeah. So I very much appreciate, what you said, and resonates with me, because that's really a lot of the reason why I did it too, so that I could work when I need to work and not when I want to work, and when I want to work. So, let's dive in. And we talked with Bernie on the show, a couple of weeks ago. And for the listeners, that should be episode, I'm looking at my 237. So that would have released a couple of weeks before this one. But he talked about selling the house. Let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, not a lot of people sell their house to get into multifamily investing. Can you walk us through your decision process and why you did that?
Well, it's a little easier for me than it was for Bernie, because my wife and daughter were living up at a ski area in a small condominium. We had 600 square foot condominium while I was down in the city working. And so, we decided that I was going to find a different arrangement. I had a friend who had a crash pad, and I rented a spare room from him, and we decided that we were going to invest all of the money from the house into real estate. And so, there was a stable foundation there. We had a place to live. Bernie, on the other hand, he sold and went out and rented a house. And so it was a little bit different than me. But very similar in nature, in that, as a traditional W-2 employee, most of our assets and resources were tied up in either our house or in our 401ks. And so it was difficult to leverage. We followed the old model: put all your money into your 401k and put it into your house, and you're going to be
your biggest investment, is what they tell you.
That's right. Right.
So,
and we weren't generating any income, and we looked at it and we said, we need to generate some income here. We need to have different streams of income, different revenue streams that we can use to not have to go into that office and punch in every day.
Yeah. And I think, for a lot of people, it's a smart move. If you have a lot of equity and you're not using it, renting a house, you can probably rent it for cheaper than you can, pay a mortgage in most metros right now. But, it's not a bad idea. It's not for everybody, but, I had a handful of investment properties, all single family rentals. And when I decided to go into multifamily, I looked at the equity in those, and I was actually renting a house myself at the time, because that's what you do in the military. But we sold our investment properties to unlock that capital and use that capital to launch our business. So, similar decision process, but like I said, we were already renting. So we just sold the assets that we had to do the same thing.
Right.
So,
right.
Well, interesting. So let's talk about some of the projects you guys have done. Pick your favorite, and let's talk about a little in detail.
Yeah. So I think the first deal we did was it was the cornerstone of everything we've done since, right? And what I mean by that is, when you start thinking about this, it's that elusive goal to get your first deal. And once you do, it kind of changes your mentality, right? Success follows success. All those those kind of ideas. And so, we went out and we found a property. It was in the beginning of COVID. The first deal fell through. That wasn't it turned out that our investors backed out on us because of COVID in March of 2020. Wasn't it would have been a solid deal, but fell through for us. And so we were wondering, can we really get this done? And a few months later, we found and came across another deal. It was a 16-unit A-class property in Tennessee. It was 3 years old, and it was a really beautiful hands-off property. It was a great, what I'll call a learning play.
Yeah.
The cash flows were solid. It didn't need a lot of CapEx. It wasn't like we were jumping in without any knowledge into a renovation situation where we had to dump all sorts of money and figure out creative financing. This was a solid apartment that kicked off cash flow. It was a great story we could tell to our investors. And, it was one of those things where we're going to hold it for a long time because it's still a great deal. And, the things I really liked about it are, number one, really proved that we could put the pieces together. Right. Second thing is we syndicated our first deal, which was, the money raising part, going out and finding people who would contribute, because Bernie and I had a business plan that said, this is not going to be our only deal. This is going to be our first deal. So we need to have some dry powder on the side. Yes, we probably could have funded it by ourselves. We would have been scraping by. But at the same time, we also wanted to build that pool of investors. And so that was important to us, that we got some people in that we trusted, they trusted us, and that we could build a long-term portfolio with them as investors in us. And then the third thing is that we bought it with Fannie Mae financing.
Nice.
We did, it was kind of the trifecta: first deal with government financing and with syndication. And so, really hard. And I think that just went to prove a combination of the skills that Bernie and I have as operators, because that's what we do for our W-2. We know how to run businesses. And that proved that people liked what we had to say. They liked us. That's important. And they were interested in learning more about how we anticipated running the business. And I think that's why that encapsulates, all the great things that we've worked up to and made us really feel successful about our win when we purchased that property.
Yeah, and I like the philosophy. A lot of the first-time investors, and we talk with a lot of first-time investors on the show, but they look for the value add because you can get them at a lower cost. It's a lower price point. You can get more doors for your money than, say, A-class. But I think you kind of hit a very important point there. You went for 16 units A-class. There's no renovations there. It's new, so there's not going to be a lot of repairs. You're going to get A-class tenants instead of C-class tenants. We don't have the same types of problems, and A-class are easier to manage. So I think that may actually be a much smarter play on your first deal than trying to buy the proverbial C-class value add, that most people are looking for in their first deal. So I think that was a great idea.
Yeah, and we're happy we did, because frankly, there's a lot to learn on the back end, right? So, day one when you own the property is different than reading about somebody else's day one.
Yeah.
When your property manager isn't doing exactly what you want them to, how do you coach them? How do you manage them? If you have experience from other places, you can prove to yourself that you can do this, right? Yeah. So it's 60% of it's getting the deal done. But that other 40 of actually making money for your investors, you don't know how to do yet. And so, it was an easier solve. And then we felt like we could jump into the next situation, which we did 2 months later. So
and it allows you to, build your build your systems, test run it, and not like the best-selling book, you nail it, then scale it, and I think that's a solid way of doing it. We bought a B-class value add on our first one, a very, very old, well-located B-class property. And I wish it was as easy as an A-class, but we've had we had a lot of growing pains. I mean, just over the last couple of years. And I think we're at a spot right now where we've ironed out almost all the kinks, but I mean, there was a trial by fire, getting that as our first asset, but hopefully you guys have successfully navigated that one, and Now, have you purchased others yet?
Yeah, we've finished 3 deals already. So we're at about 100 units.
Okay.
And we went from 16 to 32 to 39.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're just under 100 for the units we own. And
Okay.
this year we're looking to grow. Now we're at the point where we're looking for units for anything from 75 to about 150 now.
Nice.
So we've expanded our scope. We feel like we have the ability to go out and talk to people about what we've done, talk to our friends and our lists, and the people that we were able to interest in our business that maybe didn't invest the first time they saw it. And, we have a list of folks that we can go out and a list of resources where we can hopefully go out and take down a much larger and much more expensive asset and operate it.
Yeah. And that's another good way to do it. I mean, you gradually go from smaller dollar amounts, smaller unit sizes to the larger ones. And it helps on the purchase side too, because you've got the track record and experience to back up your offers. And it's a lot easier. I mean, you're coming in with, math in public, 60, like 80, 90, how many, 90 units, what you said?
90 units, yeah.
Yeah, 90 units now. And if you're putting an offer in on a 70 or an 80 unit property, you've got the track record to show to the brokers and the owners that you're able to close on a 90 unit because you've closed on 90 before. So I think it's smart and very, very good way to scale. You don't have to be in a rush. And I think what you guys are doing is the smart way to do it. So,
and it's interesting you mentioned that, the brokers, because I think to the loan brokers or to the commercial brokers that you're dealing with on the property, it's super important that they think you can actually get it done.
Yeah.
I mean, that makes a huge difference in how they negotiate with you. And when you go to them with your broker or your agent, whoever you're working with, and you say, hey, we've done this before, we can do this, they take it more seriously.
Yeah. And with the loans, the last one we closed on was a smaller property. The loan, it was the easiest loan process I've ever done. I picked up the phone and I called, our point of contact at the bank, and I said, hey, we've got another one. Can we get the same loan we got 3 months ago? Okay. Yep. Great. Yep. Sure. I'll send it over. Bye. It was that was the initial call. And 3 days later, it was approved, and so it's one of these things where when you have the track record, especially with the same lender, they're used to working with you. They've already underwritten you. They already know that you qualify for X amount. And so, we had an $8 million or I think a $6.5 million loan with them in July. And so, $1.7 million loan with them a couple months later was, yeah, we just lent you 8 million. Of course, we'll give you 1.5 or 1.7. So anyway, yeah, that lot to say about the confidence and just the ease of doing it after you have the track record. Anyway, we talked about your why. We talked about, a couple of the deals. What's next for you?
So, our hope is that within a short period of time, within the visible future, foreseeable future, that both Bernie and I can end up focused on this full time.
Yep.
So, we're building a strong foundation so that we can be doing this full time and not having to worry about the W-2 job to pay our expenses and our lifestyle. And so, we're out there actively looking for deals right now. Cleaning up, obviously, last year, that's a big deal. We did a lot of business last year. And so cleaning that up and moving into this year with a really strong head of steam. And so we are seeking deals and investors, and we're looking for people who want to partner with us.
All right. Awesome. So to the listeners, if any of that resonates with you, anything you can see in common there, definitely reach out to Mike and let him know. So we're going to shift gears here and bring Cristina on. So Cristina, welcome.
Hi, nice to be here.
Yeah, thanks. And so excited to have you on the show. We had a couple of almosts, but happy to actually have you on the show.
Yes, it was meant to be with Michael.
Yeah, I think it was. The other matches were just so, and you can't help when people reschedule. But so tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Okay, so I was born in Peru. I'm from Peru, South America. I started investing back, not here in USA, but the desire to do it started when my father in Peru. When he moved to the United States, he left me the rentals. So I was in charge of, the tenants. That's how I got the desire to buy properties. And then when I moved in 2000, I told my husband that I wanted to purchase a property for our future. That was our idea. So we bought in 2004 a small multifamily that we renovated, and we built a little, like, 2 bedrooms on the bottom, 2 bedrooms on the top. I was in charge of that project when we built that addition. So that happened between 2004 and 2008. And then I just dedicated myself to, my W-2. I was an attorney in Peru. When I moved to the United States, I left that and kind of like I started all over again. And then I started working on a law office. Then I moved to a human resources job for a corporation. I was there for 8 years. And then, I went back again to the law office. And that's when I wanted to start investing again. And that happened in 2019, that I wanted to buy more properties, scale. And I bought a couple duplexes in Indianapolis in 2021.
Okay, nice. So your first one was 2004. You did some renovations. Do you still own that one?
Yes, I still own that one in a landlord.
Now, biggest question that I think a lot of people will have is how did that property fare during the market crash? I mean, 2008, 2009 weren't great years for multifamily or for rentals. How did you guys do with that?
I did great, actually. Everybody, says that they have a very bad experience on the crash, and I had a great experience. I didn't lose my job, thank God. And I was still receiving my salary. And then my property, I already finished with the renovations, because on that time, I remember nobody wanted to build. And all of the construction people were so cheap, because they didn't have nothing to do. Nobody wanted to spend money on their properties because they were losing them. So that's when I took advantage of that, and I built all of that addition, very, very cheap, actually. And from 1-bedroom apartments, it went to 3-bedroom apartments. So I rented top dollar for all of that time on the market. I didn't have no issues with rentals.
Nice. And I had a single family home pre-crash, and obviously if you look at the value of it slid, but I had tenants the entire time that were paying.
That was the funny part. Because when I bought it not that expensive. I bought it in 2004. So the price went up in 2006, kind of the double, but then it would sink. So I went underwater. I own more money than it supposedly was the value on that multifamily, but the rents keep me afloat.
And that's exactly what happened to us. And 5 or 8 years later, when we sold it, we still had a 6-figure payday. So I think that's one of the beautiful things about real estate. When you're renting out homes and apartments, people are going to live there. It doesn't matter what the economy looks like. People need a place to live. And, even during downturns, and we saw the same thing during the COVID downturn, in a lot of our properties, we had a couple properties where occupancy went down, but in a lot of our properties, occupancy went up, and it was just, anyway, that's good to know that. So you have that first property, you bought 2 duplexes, in the last year or so. And now you're looking to get more.
Yes, that's what I want. That's my goal.
Awesome. So one question I like to ask everybody, what's your why? What's your big burning why?
My why is to own my own time. I like, be able to schedule my time the way I want. And spend it the way I want, not to be I have to be at work from 9 to 5 on my W-2. And I want real estate to be my vehicle to allow me to schedule my own time, whatever I want to spend it with,
And, I saw Michael shaking his head. That's the common theme here is, we want time back. And I think that's what a lot of people are looking for. Well, that said, Cristina, we got Mike on the line. What do you want to ask him?
Hi, Mike. Nice to meet you. I would like to know, how do you scale so fast? It costs me a little bit for me to scale.
Yeah. Right. So I think scaling just comes with good systems. And so, every time you set something up, whether it's your folders in your computer, you just figure out how you want to do it for the future, right? So every time my partner needs to go in and look for something, he doesn't have to call me and ask me where something is. He knows it's the same for every property. And so, finding economies of scale across all of the business, I think, is one of the most important things, because your time is your limiting factor. So that's whether it's with similar brokers, whether it's with similar bankers, or similar systems internally. Do things the same way every time. Keep your computer very organized so you're not looking for things in different places. Put the same folders in when you close a deal. Have the same structure in your email box for each property. And all those things carry through, and hey, where is that latest statement from my property manager? You can find it.
Yeah.
You don't have to spend hours searching, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, going back, I mentioned that book, Nail It and Scale It. That's really the whole philosophy of that book is, when you do your first thing, you document everything you've done. And that way it's easy to repeat every time, and there's a lot of time saving techniques in that, but you can improve on your systems each and every time you go through it. Maybe on your second or third purchase, you see something different that you didn't see on number one or number two. You can always update the systems, but there's a lot of time saving in developing the systems, number one. And then, when you're scaling later, going really big and adding employees, and we've got a couple now. Now it's, if you've taken the time to create the systems, you can just hand the system to your employee and say, do this, and it's a lot easier. So good question.
And how do you split your responsibilities with your partner? I know you have a partner, and I do have a partner. Did you speak with him or her before getting into the deals, or kind of like fell naturally?
I think we both tried on the first deal to understand what each other was doing, right? And we both wanted to understand the basics, the building blocks to the entire process, so that we could get through those. But we had a long working relationship, and in fact, we're coming up on 8 years working together in the office. And so, a lot of people are very strict about how they do it. I think you have to figure out the relationship you have with your partner. Bernie and I tend to, he sees that I'm doing something and he'll pick up something on his side that I normally handle, but he'll ask me what he needs. And so there's a flexibility in there, but in general, we do have some relatively, they're not defined roles, but in general, each one of us has areas that we gravitate towards. I'm better at talking with new investors. I have more experience with that. Bernie's better. He likes to do the numbers. He likes to go through the spreadsheets, and he likes to do the underwriting. We both understand them. We both need to understand them. We both need to be able to talk to investors. But, where possible, I spend a lot more time where my strengths are, and they're getting out and talking to people. And he spends his strengths looking at the details and understanding each individual piece. And so I think, you'll gravitate naturally towards areas that you both understand or have an affinity for.
Yeah.
Okay, I got you. And the market, because I'm from New York, and we are tending to go to the West. So how do you pick up your market? I know we do the research and everything, but do you live around your market or close to your market? Is that important?
We live in Idaho, and our market's in Tennessee. And so we're fortunate. We have a silent partner who's been able to be a loan sponsor for us, and he lives nearby in case we need anything from him. But essentially, we run businesses and have run businesses all over the world that we're absentee owners of, if you will, right, in our W-2. And so it's all about hiring good people and giving them, proper expectations in the areas. And when they're not meeting them, counseling them and coaching them in order to get to where you need to be. And I think, certainly it's important to see the properties that you're going to purchase. So having boots on the ground to walk units and look at, open doors and understand the tenants that are there and understand the condition of the property is super important. But once you're through that and you have someone who you think is going to be a good manager, mentoring them, providing appropriate incentives, paying them properly, making sure that they're happy working on your accounts, making sure that you're meeting their needs as well as them meeting your needs. And I think that it can certainly be successful that way. And we've had a good run with it so far.
Yeah. And I live many miles away from our properties, but my philosophy is you do need to be able to get there, and so, somebody brought up the point to me a couple, about a year ago, probably on this podcast, but look at connecting flights. I live in Idaho Falls, which is a very small metro, very small airport. So if I were in your shoes looking for my first deal, I would start looking at the markets where I can get a direct flight from Idaho Falls. And there's like 6, but look at where you can get to quickly, because there are times you're going to have to go out there and, you don't want to have to, fly from Idaho Falls to Phoenix to Denver to get to Omaha, on a leg. So yeah, don't be afraid to look outside of your local area. I think what Mike said, he's got somebody close to the property, somebody boots on the ground in case somebody needs to get there quick. But at the same time, make sure you can get the area, fairly quickly as well. In our case, I have 2 partners that live within a couple 100 miles of every single one of our properties.
Well, that's great. Yes, because, I've been receiving deals. We were like focusing on Houston, and then I've been receiving deals in San Antonio. So I was like kind of like a little far from Houston.
Yep.
I don't know if that's okay to keep changing markets so much.
Yeah. Well, you develop centers of gravity in a market. And so while we'd like to be closer to home right now, where we can get there quicker, right now we have brokers and we have property managers who know about properties that are going on the market before they hit the market. And so, we've done business with them. They know we can close the deals. And so they're going to bring a deal to us before they bring it to some unknown entity. And so we're seeing deal flow continue to be in that center of gravity where we are.
Yeah.
And so that's worked out well. And eventually we will start to develop the relationships closer to where we are so we can get there. Yeah. But for now, we're seeing good deal flow in those areas and people are bringing us off market deals. That's kind of the golden goose right there, right?
Yeah.
Off market deals.
Yes.
I think there's a lot of advantage to focusing. I don't think there's anything wrong between, Houston and San Antonio. Both are good markets. But piggybacking off of what Mike said is, you're going to get a reputation you're going to build a reputation in one market. And it's easier to get source deals in a market where you have a reputation, or where you've developed relationships. If you don't have a reputation yet, you've developed relationships with brokers. You're not going to have the same relationships in San Antonio if you immediately jump over there, and you're going to have to start building those relationships again. I found in my case, I didn't hit my first. We didn't get our first deal. I wasn't not quite a home run. It's probably a single or a double. We didn't get our first deal until I actually focused and got rid of every other market, and I focused on one. And when I focused on one in relationships, that's what started getting the deal flow for me. Instead of calling a broker one day in Tennessee, one next day in Alabama, the next day in South Carolina, I focused on one metro. So nothing wrong with looking in 2 metros at once. Just realize that you're going to have to start relationships from ground zero.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you. And another question I have, like a newbie, like, the buildings, what are your no-nos for these buildings?
Yeah.
Do you have certain criteria that you are completely like, this is my box and I'm not going to move from here?
Mm-hmm.
I think Brian mentioned it earlier, and I think there's a lot of people who want to go out and buy a C-class building and do renovations off the get-go. And I think you really got to watch yourself in that area, because you never know what's underground, right? And so if there's any sign of problems, depending, if they've done a full refurb on the rest of the property, but they haven't touched any of the the piping or any of the sewage, to me, that's a red flag.
Yeah.
Because it's going to need something. And so, strong, good bones of a building, if they've been cared for, are good, but you got to check them out, and you got to be able to think that you might have to walk away if things aren't there. And we did that. And so, owners who are problematic about giving you details or wanting you to check those things out, then to me, that's just a no-go. We'll walk away from a deal. If people won't give you the benefit of the doubt on things of that nature, really structural, foundational pieces of the property. And we've done that a couple of times.
Yeah. And we do have, once again, very, very valid points. We have one property that was built in the 30s, one in the 40s, a couple in the 70s, and our newest one was built in the 80s, right? So, older properties have more problems. They really, really do. And they tend to be expensive problems when you do have them. Cast iron piping, it was really, really good, 60, 80 years ago, but not so great right now. So I think when you're coming up with your no-go criteria, very, very military term, your no-go criteria, look at the things that you're not willing to do. And some people, one of their no-go criteria is they don't like flat roofs because they are expensive to fix. We're doing that right now on a property. They're very expensive to fix. Some people will say 80s and newer because they don't want to deal with the plumbing and electrical problems from 70s and before. But we have, we're a little more open to things, but once again, the older the property is, the more problems you're going to have with it because of age and whatnot. And, certain materials, when they were newly instituted, we find out 20, 30, 40 years later, they don't age well. Plumbing's a big one, and that makes a lot of problems. So, my recommendation is, figure out what you don't want to deal with and, build your criteria around that.
Thank you.
All right, we got time for one more if you got another question.
Oh, yes, I have a bunch of questions. Well, another thing that I noticed is a lot of people now that I, spoke about real estate, everybody is approaching me and they want, oh, yes, I would like to do what you do, or I have this amount of money, friends and family. How do you convert those people once you have a deal to invest in your deal? Because they talk to me now, but until I have a deal, it could be like some months. So how someone keeps the momentum?
All right. I mean, are you keeping them do you have a list of all those folks who've mentioned it to you? Right, because that's the first and foremost things. You got to keep a list of people that you talk to. However you do that, whether it's via an email box that you stash all those in so you can go back and look for them, or an Excel file. And, you got to reach out to them every once in a while and just let them know what you're doing. And then, actually getting them to provide you with money, you got to figure that there's going to be some fallout, right? A lot of people want to know. And then once they learn more, they're timid or they're scared, or, you don't have a track record yet, but down the line, they could be a good resource. Or you can ask them, hey, do you know anybody who might be interested?
Yeah.
And so you may not get them as a financial resource, but you can tell them, hey, tell your friends that, what I'm doing, or tell my cousins what I'm doing, and maybe they're interested. And don't be afraid to call them back up and say, hey, I have a live deal. Or, hey, we were looking at a deal, it fell through. The reason it fell through is because we didn't like the criteria. There was something about it. The guy wasn't willing to fix some things and be honest with them, open and honest about your progress. And I think those are things that we've done, and it's been very helpful. And we've picked up investors, on our second and third deal that we didn't get on the first one because they were a little nervous. Yeah. And we're slowly expanding the web to more and more people. And, we're asking our folks to, if they know anyone who's interested, to please send them our way. And I think that's helped quite a bit.
Yeah. I like to think of investors as kind of an incubator. You have to keep them warm. Otherwise, they'll never hatch, so to speak, using the same example. But, just like Mike said, keep a list. And I have a Google form that I use every time I talk to somebody for the first time about investing, and I type their information in a Google form, and that's my list. That's my system for, the new investor calls, anybody who's interested. And then like he said, you communicate with them. I love how he put that. You tell them, hey, we looked at several deals last month. None of them worked out. We're going to keep on looking. Send an email to everybody in your distro list once a month and just keep them up to date. And I love the next thing he said, which was ask for referrals. We've gotten a lot of referrals investing in our deals, from people who have, hey, I liked investing in this. Can my friend invest too? So we've had a lot of unsolicited referrals, but if you start asking for referrals and people like you, they're going to be very glad to introduce you to their friends. So a lot of good wisdom there, a lot of good answers. Thanks a lot, Mike, on that one. And we're about out of time. So last question for each of you. Mike, you go first. How can listeners learn more about you?
So they can reach out to me directly, Mike at elementalequityllc.com, or they can find us on the web at www.elementalequityllc.com. Or they can always pick up the phone and give me a call. I can be reached at 208-401-4951.
All right. And Cristina, same questions for you. How can our listeners learn more about you?
I'm very active on Facebook. And I just opened my Instagram account, Cristina_RE_solutions. And also on LinkedIn. I also active in LinkedIn.
All right.
And also me too. 845-699-6102.
6102. Okay, perfect. All right. Well, thanks a lot, guys, for coming back on the show, or coming on the show. Sorry about that. Very much appreciate you guys' time. And, I learned a lot, and I hope you guys had a good time. Thanks.
Oh, it was
really fun.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. Nice to meet you.
Thank you, and best of luck, Cristina. Please let me know if you need anything.
And thank you, Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Brian.
Hey, if you like that episode, make sure to subscribe. But more importantly, if you haven't joined our multifamily educational community yet, which we call the Tribe of Titans, you are missing out. Get 30 days free by clicking the link in the description to this episode, or go to thetribeoftitans.info, and we'll see you there.